Hey fellow gamers, it's me, Mario. So let's start off this new series of mine. I was thinking about starting with some theory, but then I thought this series is already an experiment. I don't know if people will be able to follow it through. So I chose to start with one or two things that are really, practical, something that you can touch with your hands. So this is your first time playing a game. Don't think about other things. I think it's a very interesting topic to talk about just because the first time you're sitting at a table with your friends trying out a new game is a very different experience than any other one you're going to find while playing a game, I think. So while I am the kind of guy who likes to think a lot about games, who focuses on one game per time normally, maybe two, it depends, and play like 20 or 30 times that game until I've understood at least the frame of the game, the most important parts of it, etc. etc. I think that first time you play a game, it's still probably one of the most important thing you should focus on, especially since if you're not like me, you like to, and you're like the uh, average board game player, you like to try a lot of different games, which is something that I love too. It's just that I like to focus more. I think it's going to be really important to understand how to approach a game. This is the way I do it, but again, it's something that I distilled out of endless hours spent on trying to understand better board games. So maybe you can relate to it. So let's jump onto it, shall we? The first contact. So when you sit at the table, there are a few things you should try to understand already from the explanation of the rules. Uh, Either if it's you reading the rulebook for the first time, so you can think about it even before your first game. But if somebody else is explaining it to you, you should try to understand these three bullet points first, and from that point you can develop your strategy, you can develop whatever else you're going to need to win the game. So first off, find the resources and the assets. So there are many definitions for resources and assets. In this video I'm just going to talk about resources as something you spend, and the assets for something you spend for. So the resources are what you spend to get assets. Now, depending on the game, this changes quite a bit. In some games, resources are already points, end game points, but most of the time they're just a commodity. Um, so when you spend them on assets, you should try to understand that most of the assets fall into two big groups, I would say. Some of them will help you with your engine, so are pretty good in the early game, and some of them are going to help you get victory points. So they are better, of course, in the late game. Most of them, though, fall into both groups, and depending on how much they fall into one of them, they're going to be better in the first half of the game or in the second half of the game. But trying to, when you're thinking about the game, when you're framing it, you should already think, okay, this is a resource and I can spend it, and this is an asset I can get. This should be clear even before starting the game from the explanation of the rules. Then you have to understand the victory conditions. So basically, two very important things. One is how to improve your game, which normally involves some kind of engine building. And the other one is how to win the game, which normally involves victory points and victory conditions. Victory conditions are normally both the end game triggers and the things that are going to give you the win. So these are like two things that most of the time go hand in hand, like let's say Scythe. In Scythe, most of the time the guy who triggers the end game, maybe it's not going to automatically be the winner, but for sure is in a good position to be the winner. And most of the time when you are the one who triggers the end of the game, you already know in which position you are. So I think, I mean, it depends a lot. Like in Great Western Trail, sometimes you have to close the game even though you already know you're not going to be the winner. But knowing the victory conditions, the end game trigger, and the important assets that determines who's going to be the winner are something you have to keep in mind along with the engine building part. So I think these two broad categories, how to build an engine and how to win the game, should be clear to you right at the start of the game. You don't know anything about strategy, you don't know anything about the pace of the game, but you should already know what is going to help you become better in a game and what is going to help you win the game. It's pretty important to have these two different groups clear because at some point during the game, there's normally a switch. In some games, it's clear and cut. So at that point, you should switch onto victory points. In some other games, it's more fluid, and I think the second group is normally more interesting. The first group is normally medium weight games, where it's easy to tell when there's this distinction. But the flow of the game shouldn't be clear to you. But what is important in the first half and what in the second half, maybe it's not half, maybe it's just the last quarter or the first quarter, depending on the game, it should be clear to you right from the start. To give you some examples, in Great Western Trail, I think it's almost more than half of the game that you're dedicating to building an engine. Uh, Half of the game not talking about actions, but talking about the worker market area. So when you're already past the half point, you're still building an engine. In some other games, it's actually the opposite. Like in Boon Lake, you should focus on victory points right from the second quarter, I think. So it depends a lot, but it's something you're going to learn with experience. But you have to be clear to you what is engine building and what is victory points and victory conditions. And then do some gut assessments. So basically, you don't have any data at the beginning of the game other than what the rules are telling you and your previous experience with Euro games. You don't have many other elements to make your choices. So just follow your guts. If you think that somebody is going to work out fine on that setup or because the other opponents are doing something, go for it. You don't have to dwell too much on that choice on your first game. That's how you play it. So, I told you what you should do when you first sit at the table and listen to the rules and watch at the board, watch at your player board. Now, let's say what you're going to do during a game. So, identify strategy paths if there's any. Not all of the games, like some games are very tactical in their nature, so there's less strategy to them. I mean, there's always a bit of strategy, but sometimes the path is not clear. In some other games, it's pretty clear. Let's talk about. I know I'm doing some examples, but I think they help understanding things better. Like in Viscounts of the West Kingdom, it's pretty easy to see the three different paths that are like manuscripts, the castle, and buildings. And the same in Great Western Trail, like you have cowboys, engineers, and builders. Of course, you can mix and match these different paths, but at least you should try to understand them. Again, in some games it's easier, in some other it's harder, but most of the time, if you're already a good Euro player, and by good I don't mean you win a lot, but you have a lot of experience with Euro style board games in general, you should be able to identify some strategies. The main one, the easy ones, that are the ones that are designed to be understood at first sight. So first, determine which ones are there. Then find an open lane, any will do. Again, you don't have to dwell too much on this choice, but it's pretty clear that, again, talking about Great Western Trail, if your first three opponents chose to purchase or to hire a cowboy, you should go for something else. So finding an open lane means trying to understand what your opponents are going for and try to go for something different. Like most of the time, you should be able to try to find an open-ish lane. It's always, I mean, it's not always, that easy. But you should try to do it nonetheless in the first few turns slash rounds slash actions that you're going to take in a game, and then go deep on it. It's your first game. You're not going to understand all the little details or the nuances that are there in a game. Just go for it. Choose a strategic path and hammer it. Yes, you're going to lose a lot of the small stuff that make games very good, but it's not important on your game, on your first game, I think. What I always try to do on my first game is trying to force something. I think that being open is most of the time in most games, it should at least be the best approach to a game. So you should try to be open, you should try to find a good lane to follow, but on your first game, any lane will do. I mean, it's better if it's not one that your opponents took, just because when somebody zigs, you should zag. But other than that, just go with it because you can get a feel from it. You can understand what's good and what's not when you're doing this plan, what things are missing, what you should do, how to cover some weaknesses of the plan that you chose, and what are the strengths of the plan that you chose. After the game, you can also talk about it with your opponents. This is something really important. It's something we can talk about in like 1 minute or so, and it's something I will focus on in another video, I think, like talking with your play group and trying to understand how things can develop in a game after the game has ended. But for now, just stick to your plan. It's going to work or it's not going to work, but you're going to learn a lot from it. Then from the second game, you can try something different, or you can try the same, but this time with the knowledge, armed with the knowledge that you got from the first game. But on the first game, just go deep on one open lane. That's my suggestion. And then there's the aftermath, which is trying to identify the shortcomings of your strategy. I think this is easily the most important thing you should do after your first game. Like, let's say you went for Cowboys in Great Western Trail. Again, I'm talking a lot about Great Western Trail, not only because I know it in and out, but also because I think my audience knows it. So, let's say you went for Cowboys and you found that it's very easy, of course, to get decent deliveries. That sometimes it's frustrating not to get the cows that you wanted in your hand, but sometimes you can identify what went wrong. Like you were paying too much for deliveries, so you got good deliveries, but you didn't get many coins out of them just because you didn't move your train, or you from like half of the game you start being slow because the other opponents littered the path with buildings while you didn't have any of them, because again on your first game it's fine to just focus on one path. So maybe you didn't do a lot of things. You should try to identify what went wrong and try to understand why it was so. If it's like a fault that is like innate in the strategy that you chose, so that you have to try to play around it, or if it's something about your game plan that wasn't alright and you should mix it a bit more to cover that weakness. So doing a final assessment, it's very important on your strategy. Try to understand what went right, what didn't go that well instead, and try to understand what was the strength of your plan and what was the weakness. Is It's not only going to tell you something about your strategy, the path that you chose, but it's also going to show you why other paths might be very important, might work pretty well. So you should you're already exploring the game a bit, even though you focused on just one strategy to understand it better. You are already like looking around you and watching what the other guys have done. So you can understand a lot from that. Then changes from the initial assessment. Like from the start of the game, you thought, again, let's talk about Grandmaster Trade, but you can talk about many other games. Let's say you thought that heads were important But in the end, it seemed they were not that good because you spent a lot of coins on them, but you didn't get enough return from that. You can you can start a train of thoughts from that point, and you should try to divide the problem into smaller sections and try to understand what changed it from your initial assessment. Like your initial assessment was focusing is good, but then you found out that you weren't able to manage to take that action many times. Why did that happen? Maybe you were moving so slow that you weren't able to take the cow market enough times. Or maybe it's because you were buying one head at a time. Again, I'm just talking Great Western Trail here, but you can talk about many games. Like you can start with an assessment in Agricola, and since like in Great Western Trail going to Kansas City is good, maybe in Agricola you can think that getting begging or beggar, I don't remember the name, cards is good. You can try to, don't get food early on and win without it. But if at the end of the game you have like half of the points of your opponents, you should try to understand what was wrong with your starting assessment. So maybe losing even a few points in Agricola is not good, even at the beginning of the game. So there are a lot of assessments that we make at the start of the game, and that's good. That's good. You should try to frame a game even starting from the rules, but you have to be really ready to change all of your assessment after the game. And you should do it every time. Like the more you know a game, the more you know that your starting assessments were not good, but the more the overall assessments are going to be right. So you're basically building knowledge in time, but you should be able to do this process each and every time. And at the end of the first game, I think it's the most important one because probably all of your assessments, or at least most of your assessments, are going to be wrong, and you have to be ready to challenge them in the next game. It's a big part of improving as a player, doing this process each and every time, and starting with your first game is already pretty important. And then analyzing the moving parts of the game. So again, you start a game, you think that something is going to happen, but by the end of the game, that was very different. Like, I tried very recently a game called Cryo, Cryo. It's a very different game from many other ones because it's a medium heavy, probably even light. It's on the lighter side of Euro games, and I started my game thinking that the end of the game will come at a certain point, and instead it was way faster, like unbelievably faster. So it's pretty good to analyze every single part of your game and see how that by part I mean like really objects, assets. How did they move during the game? Again, like in Barrage, when you start off your first game of Barrage, it looks like it's going to be impossible to reach some energy thresholds. But after the game, you should have understood that these thresholds will be achievable if you build a proper infrastructure. So analyzing each and every part of the game, it's of course very linked to the previous point of changes from the initial assessment, because normally analyzing the moving parts of the game has a lot to do with your starting assessment and how wrong you were. But analyzing all the single parts of the game is pretty important. This is like the math that I do normally with games. It's when I do the math in games. Like after my first game, if the game is mine, if it's not mine, normally I ask my friends to get a picture or I try to find one on BGG. I try to take a look at, let's say, again, Barrage. I'm looking at the contracts and I'm trying to understand what the resources mean, what the rewards are, how much you spend and how much you got. So trying to do some math at the end of the game by analyzing all the moving parts, again, all the things that are going to change during the game, is going to give you a better idea of how the game itself works. It's not all there, of course. Again, analyzing the speed of the game, the pace of the game, the choices of the other players, the contested choices especially, is going to be very important. But just taking a look at the moving parts, at the assets in a game, is going to tell you a lot. And it's something you can do after your first game. It's something that I wouldn't suggest to do before. That's why I place this point in the aftermath. Like, you can do the math before starting a game. Like, you can play a game and watch, let's say, Lost Ruins of Arnak. You can watch at all the different locations and all the different guardians and try to memorize them, but that won't do you any good, or it will just make the first game go really slow, because you can analyze everything but you don't have the proper frame. You have just numbers, you don't have a frame. While after your first game you should already have like a very sketchy frame of the game, and in that frame, using that frame, you can understand better these moving parts. This is why it's at the end. I know a lot of players that try to start the game already knowing the little details, the moving parts that are in the game, but they don't know the frame because they have no way to know it. Because even if they watched like a playthrough online, they didn't play the game, so they don't know enough about choices. After the first game, that's where this is going to be important. All right, I think this video is already pretty long. I hope it's going to be, again, interesting enough. If you like it, I don't know, leave a comment or something. I'm going to post another one probably on Thursday morning. We'll see. After that, I'm going to be probably 2 weeks in the USA to do a holiday there, but I should be able to record a video before going there. So you should find 2 videos per week still, even in the first half of June. All right, guys, hope you enjoy it. Matters out. Bye bye.